Hello, this is Patricia Merrifield, and I'm here to talk about the Camino de Santiago. Just to start at the very beginning, what is the Camino de Santiago? It's a walk, or it could be a bike ride or a horseback ride, but it goes to the tomb of St. James in northwest Spain. It's very ancient. Camino is way, and Santiago is St. James. So it's the way of St. James, because a lot of the experience is on the way. Some people say the way is made by walking, that it's not just getting there, but it's a process. So who was St. James? He was one of the apostles of Jesus. He was on the very inner circle. There were only 3 apostles who accompanied Jesus for the raising of Lazarus and for the transfiguration, and they were Peter, John, and James. Before he died, Jesus talked about taking the story to the ends of the earth or to every nation. So a lot of the apostles did. There isn't really a lot of history, not a lot of documents to support all this, but St. Thomas may have gone to the Indian subcontinent. St. Mark may have gone to Egypt. The people in those areas are certain that those apostles did go there. There is a legend also that St. James went to Spain. In fact, there's an account of a miracle that happened to St. James close to the city of Zaragoza, that he saw the Virgin Mary on a pillar, just on a pillar. And so that's kind of the root of the woman's name, Pilar, in Spanish. But there is a complication because it's also pretty well documented, as things go for 2,000 years ago. It's pretty well documented that he was beheaded in Jerusalem in the year 43. So that is a complication in the legend. Of course, there's various versions of the legend, but the most frequent one that I have heard is that the disciples of James then put his body in a boat and took him to the northwest part of Spain because he had been there, and that's apparently where they thought he wanted to be buried. More complications, there is a church in Jerusalem that has his head. They say another version of the legend is that the boat had no crew and it just went by itself. And some people say it was a cement boat, which of course the Romans did have. At this time, Palestine was a Roman colony, you might say. So they took his body and buried it. And then the information about where the body was buried was lost. And one day, right around the year 800, a hermit named Pelayo saw lights, he saw stars, he heard singing, and he went and started digging in what had been a Roman cemetery. And he discovered bones. And he said, "It's St. James." And he told his bishop, and his bishop came and looked at the bones and said, "It's St. James." And then the Pope even came out from Rome and looked at the bones and said, "By golly, it's St. James." So it was all certified that these were indeed the bones of the apostle. They built a little chapel at the spot, and then pilgrims started coming. Pilgrimage was very big in this time. This was the Middle Ages. It was between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. People sometimes call it the Dark Ages. I take a little offense at that because I'm a fan of the Middle Ages. But it's true that Rome had an overall administrative capacity, and then everything broke down into smaller and smaller units. This area was not called Spain at that time. The Romans called it Hispania, and before that there were Celtics there. It wasn't completely dark. Relics are extremely important because the people believed that they had power, that the person who these were the relics of had power in their life. So even their bones retained power after their death. especially they had power to cure and to postpone death. So people had a great urge to go on pilgrimage. And I mean, like today, probably each person who went had a constellation of reasons for going. The pilgrimage to Santiago, the symbol of the pilgrimage is a shell, and that's because it's pretty close to the Atlantic coast. So people who had been sentenced to go on pilgrimage, or who had been told by their confessor they had to go on pilgrimage, they had to bring back a shell to show that they had actually gotten to the ocean and they hadn't just been kind of hiding out 20 or 30 miles away. In this time, 99% of people never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. So it would have been possible to go a fairly short distance and nobody would know you. The story would most likely not get back to the person who told you you had to go. So you had to bring a shell back from the ocean to show that you had gotten. That's one version of how the shell came to be the symbol of the Camino. There is also, it's sometimes called the first travelogue or first travel guide. I guess that's more accurate, first travel guide. There is a 12th century document. It's called the Codex Calixtinus. It was supposedly written by Pope Calix II, but historians think that's not the case. It was ascribed to him. But it's got many parts to it. And the last part of the Codex is the Travelogue. And it tells you from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port all the cities to visit and where the monasteries are that you could stay at and what the miracles are associated with all these parts. It also talks about the shell. Now, this was from the 12th century, so if these remains were found in around 800, so that's still, 300 years. And so whoever the author was said that, well, the early pilgrims used to go and collect shells. So it is an old idea that the shell is the symbol of the Camino de Santiago. Many people think of the Camino in terms of Spain or maybe France, but actually it's all over Europe because the ancient pilgrims just walked out their front door, and many of them would walk to a city, a significant city in their area, because they wanted to travel in groups, because it was very dangerous. A lot of them were ill and died on the route. And of course, it would be great if there were some people going with them who could perhaps send word back to their village or give them care in their last days. The modern Camino is based on the routes that these ancient pilgrims followed. There's not a whole lot of history, not a whole lot of documents about exactly which step they took, but there's evidence that there were pilgrims staying in this city and then pilgrims staying in that city. The Camino just kind of goes in between. To talk about the Camino today, I could talk about my own experience, which is really all I could talk about. The first year I went with my husband, and we started in the southeastern part of France. There's a little town called Le Puy, and that's a place where pilgrims used to gather, so that's where we started walking. And it's a beautiful walk. It goes through some hills, and it goes on a high plateau called the Aubrac Plateau. And eventually you come to a place in the Basque Country called Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. Saint-Jean is St. John, and this particular little town is named after John the Baptist. And then you go over the Pyrenees, which again, isn't as hard as it sounds. There's two ways. You can go over the Pyrenees, but it's through a pass, and it's called the Pass Napoleon, because when Napoleon invaded Spain, this is the route he and his armies took. So if a whole bunch of of wagons and soldiers can go this way, it's not too bad. Or you can go around, and that's the way Val Carlos. But I know that even today, this very day, you can't actually do the way Napoleon because it snowed in. I have friends who've done the Camino, and I had just happened to know that it snowed in, and you can't do that today. Today, you have to go around. But in the summer and sort of most of the time, most people prefer to go on the route Napoleon. In a couple of days after you go over the top, right at the top is the border between Spain and France. So you leave France and you get into Spain, and the first big place you come to is Pamplona. And then you take a turn. You've been going south, and now you start going west. So that year, we got almost to Burgos, and my husband died. So obviously I came home and took care of business. And then I took his ashes back to Spain and started walking again from the spot where he had died, and went to Santiago. And then further on, many pilgrims will go to the ocean, as many ancient pilgrims did. So there's two spots where most people go on the Atlantic coast. And one, if you've seen the movie The Way, Martin Sheen went to Murcia, where it was a very rough sea. But I went instead to Finisterre, means end of the world. So I went to Finisterre and persuaded a fisherman to take me out in his boat and put his ashes into the sea. I had him take me out of the bay into the ocean and put Charles's ashes into the Atlantic. He had been in the Navy, he loved to sail, he loved the ocean, so that's where I put his ashes. This was all in 2008, and I might say that when Charles and I were walking, we'd come to see other people, meet other pilgrims, and it seemed like quite often people would say, "Is this your first Camino?" And we'd think, "Of course. Well, why would anybody do this twice? There's so many things to see in the world. Why on earth would anybody do this twice?" But now I've done it many times. And it's kind of indescribable, but it just sort of takes hold of you. Anyway, so that was 2008. And then I went back in 2011 with my grandson, who was at that time 11. We started walking from Constance, Germany, which actually geographically seems like it ought to be part of Switzerland. And we walked from Constance to Geneva and then on to Le Puy in France. Then in 2012, my grandson and I walked from Le Puy to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. And when 2013 came around, I was really hoping that he would come with me to do the Spanish part. But he was a teenager and that didn't appeal. So anyway, I went back in 2014 and started in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. But 99.9% of people who are in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port go over the Pyrenees and go down to what's called the Camino Frances. But I went due west from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port and crossed the border into Spain, into the town of Irún. And this is a Camino that goes right along the north coast. And again, always unforeseen events. The unforeseen event in 2014 was that I fell and broke my leg. So obviously I had to come back. And then quite a medical journey, but at any rate, in 2017, I was finally ready to go back. So again, I started right where I fell and walked to Santiago. And then I walked back, again, 99% an east to west trail, but I walked west to east back to a town called Oviedo. And then in 2019, walked from Prague in the Czech Republic to Augsburg in Germany. I had intended to walk all the way to Constance, but I had trouble with my feet and I had to take about 10 days off, so I didn't quite make it. I only got to Augsburg. So then in 2021, I went back and just walked from Augsburg. I actually went to Lindau and then took a ferry to Constance. So I guess I'll get on to how to do it these days. Well, there's many ways to do it. There are various tour companies. You can take a very luxurious tour. stay in all the nicest places and have gourmet lunches delivered as you walk. Or there's all other kinds of tour companies. What I like to do is to walk every step and carry my pack every step. If you feel like you'd like to walk, but you can't carry a pack, you can rent a burro, you can make a little trailer and put yourself in harness. And there are companies who will take your pack from one place to another. My kind of rule for myself is that I want to do what the Pilgrim in the 12th century could do. So I don't take trains or buses, but especially if people find that they only have a month or they only have 3 weeks, they want to get to Santiago. Some people will take buses and take a train from one place to another. There's a part of the Camino that some people just don't like. It's called the Meseta. It's a plateau. It's very flat, rather dry. There are not many trees. It gets very hot in the summer. What I have done on the Meseta is just start out while it's dark and walk until it gets too hot and find some place, maybe a bar. Bars in Europe are totally different from bars in this country. Kids go to bars, they have video games in bars, they serve food in bars, but they're called bars. If you want to go on Camino this year or someday, I would suggest, number one, that you practice before you go. Kind of think how many miles a day you want to walk. Walk that far every day. I would say for at least 30 days. If you want to walk 10 miles on the Camino per day, then try to walk 10 miles a day for 30 days before you go. Or if you want to walk 15 miles, walk 15 miles. And if you want to carry your pack, I have purchased a couple of 10-pound bags of rice or beans or whatever and put it in my pack. However much weight you imagine you want to carry. There are people who carry 75 pounds in their pack. But, I myself limit myself to 20 pounds in my pack, and then I add food and water, which brings it up to about 25 pounds. People have asked about footwear and blisters. And again, I think, at least 30 days while you're doing this practice walking, you should be breaking in whatever footwear you want. I no longer use heavy boots, just running shoes or walking shoes. I think they have something called trail running shoes, something lightweight. And what to take, I just take 2 of everything, 2 shirts, 2 brassieres, 2 trousers, 2 panties. So I do take 3 pairs of socks. I can't tell you why, but I take 3 pairs of socks. So there's 1 on my body and 1 in the pack. And you may say, but after I do the Camino, I want to do a more or less tourist tour and I'll want some other clothes. Well, you can either mail them to Santiago, to General Delivery Santiago, and pick them up there when you get there, or you can just buy clothes. That's what I've generally done. If I want to, after I finish walking, go someplace where I want a different kind of clothes, I just buy them there, buy some cheap clothes there. People have asked about blisters. So I must say that I never had blisters till I broke my leg. Then after that, that must have changed my gait just enough. And then I started having blisters. And there are as many theories and practices about blisters as there are pilgrims on the Camino. But my personal outlook on blisters is that they are nature's bandages. Some people pop blisters. That gives me the willies. I mean, maybe you think that's the thing to do with blisters, and as long as it works for you, keep doing it. But for me, as long as blisters are intact, I just leave them alone. They're nature's bandages. And if they pop on their own, well, that's a different story. I usually take a little first aid kit anyway, so I always have some antibiotic ointment and I put that on. There's a product that you can get on Amazon. I don't see it very often on pharmacy shelves here, but it's called Compeed, and I think it's wonderful. So I put on a little antibiotic cream and then put on Compeed. And in fact, if you see just skin that's persistently red, you've had your shoes off for a couple hours and there's still some spot on your foot that's quite red, go ahead and put on Compeed then. Don't wait for an actual blister to form. The blisters are a subject of a lot of conversation on the Camino because, like I say, everybody has their own theory of the best way to handle them. This is the Meseta, and those are not mountains in the background, those are clouds. I love the Meseta. I love the quietness of it, the unimpeded view, just the horizon. And for me, it's kind of mystical. But like I said, it does get hot, and so I like to not walk during the middle of the day. This is Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. There is a hill, as you can see, and on the top of the hill is the Citadel, or what used to be where the army stayed. It was a walled city. It's just a typical street in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. And this is a statue of St. John the Baptist. I always think he's saying, this is the way, this is the Camino. Oh, and when you meet people on the Camino, you can say Buen Camino, or you can say Ultra Ia. Buen Camino is just Spanish for have a good trip, and Ultra Ia is Latin for go forward. This is part of going over the Pyrenees. There are horses with bells. They are horses with bells because it's often foggy. It's pretty high, and it's often foggy. The trail and the road are the same here. So an occasional car will drive over. So you can't see the horses in the fog. This was a miraculous clearing of the fog. And I might say also that in the evenings, about dusk, there is a car that drives this route looking for pilgrims who have not made it over. They pick up all the stragglers. When you hear the bells, you might possibly think that they're cows, but they're not cows, they're horses. And it's so cars don't run into them if they happen to be standing on the road in the fog. And this is another part of the trail going over the Pyrenees. It's beautiful light, and you can see how this is pretty typical, this thickness of pilgrims. There are some places on the Camino where it's just like a line at the supermarket or something. There's so many pilgrims, but here, this is about typical. There's a few pilgrims you see. People ask about guidebooks. Well, I used to always carry guidebooks, but they're heavy, and so now I just use the online ones. And this is in Roncesvalles. There was a big room, and you can't see from this picture, but there were triple bunk beds, and there were about 50 of these triple bunk beds. So that means there were 150 pilgrims in this one room. But it was amazingly quiet. In fact, I slept on the top bunk, and it was very cool. It's a stone building. It's an old stone building. And there's little tiny windows at the top. So I was up there at the top, and I really enjoyed being there. A lot of the albergues, you have to be out early. Most will say by 8 o'clock, but this particular albergue, you had to be out by 7 in the morning. Most people shower in the evening. When they arrive, the first thing to do is shower because you're hot and sweaty. And so you shower, and then the next morning, but you want to brush your teeth or whatever. You have to do all that and pack up your stuff and be out the door before 7 o'clock. Starting at 6 o'clock, they started a recording of Gregorian chant. They started it out very, very soft, and then it got a little bit louder and a little bit louder. And finally, everybody woke up to Gregorian chant. This is Pamplona, City Hall of Pamplona. That's where you make your big turn and go west. And this is Burgos, a sort of famous monastery. This obviously is one of the brothers, and we were the pilgrims staying there that particular night. If you know anything about Spanish history, there's a famous warrior called El Cid, and there's all kinds of legends about El Cid, but he apparently came to this particular monastery and left his wife and daughters here while he went out fighting. The legend holds that he was a Christian who was always fighting the Moors, but in fact he was a mercenary and he fought for anybody, whoever would pay him. There were some wars, Christian against Moors, and he fought on both sides at various times. There were wars, Christian to Christian, there were wars, Moors to Moors, and he just fought in whoever paid him the most. But the legend holds that he was a great Christian warrior and associated with this particular monastery. This is actually kind of close to Meseta. You can see the colors, and this is Leon. This is the Parador. The Paradors are very expensive and very nice hotels owned by the Spanish government. They have taken old historic buildings and repurposed them as hotels, and it's a source of income for the country. And just another nice picture of nature. This was obviously quite a wet spot with all these ferns and shade. I love the colors, that little sprinkling of yellow. It's nice. And this is another albergue, and this one happens to be owned by the Confraternity of St. James, which is the British support organization for the Camino. Most countries have one, even the Czech Republic. This is run by the British, and so they serve tea in the afternoon. Here's a Korean pilgrim making music with his hands. It was quite haunting. I had never heard anything like it. There are many Korean pilgrims on the Camino. You know, somebody wrote a book and sparked interest. And then, of course, those people come back and they spark more interest, etc. And there's quite a number of Koreans on the Camino, including youth groups. There'd be a group of 20 or maybe 30 young people with a couple of chaperones. They have it all planned out. See, I like to just walk and then look around and see if I can find a place to stay. But of course, if you've got a big group like that, you've got to have it planned out. And it just depends on your comfort. You know, if you're more comfortable making reservations all the way, do it. You know, do what makes you comfortable so you can enjoy being there. This is called the Cruz de Ferro. It's a little hard to see, but there is a cross at the top of that big pole. People leave things there. A neighbor of mine asked me to take something to leave at the Cruz de Ferro, and it was something that she had been given by a former boyfriend for whom she still had a lot of feelings. There are a lot of pictures of people who have died, and people leave things at the Cruz de Ferro. And I believe that's the highest point on the Camino in Spain. This is sunset. And see, these are all the people who were in the albergue that night. This was a parochial, meaning it was run by the parish in this town. And so the people who were staffing the albergue were all parishioners. And they told us to go to this place. Of course, you can't see it, but there is a big canyon right in front of us. And it's kind of a dramatic sunset. And this is another albergue. This also is in a monastery, but this one has all these wonderful paintings. And this is typical, this is the top of bunk beds, but that's about how close they generally are. And so they have blankets, they have sheets and pillow slips. This one is using, looks like cloth, but many albergues these days are using paper sheets and paper pillowcases. But still, you can get a blanket. I sometimes carry my sleeping bag. They don't usually have an equal number of beds and blankets. They usually have more beds than they have blankets. So if it fits in with your weight limit, sometimes I've also carried what I call an airplane blanket. Those are very thin things that they give you on planes. And this albergue is in Galicia. And I actually worked here for 2 weeks, taking the sheets off the beds, cleaning the bathroom, sweeping. And this albergue, you can see, is a very ancient group of buildings, stone buildings. And the showers there were 4 walls with an entrance, but I don't think they had a roof. But they do have a laundry machine. Some places do and some places don't. And they have a kitchen, so you can cook your own meals. In this place, right next door, there's a very nice restaurant, and everybody goes there. Almost everybody. There still are people cooking meals, but in some places where there's not a restaurant nearby, there might be a little market, pilgrims will get together and buy food and cook food and eat together. And actually, I like that quite a lot. I like that a lot. I like the solitude of walking alone. But then it's great to have camaraderie in the evening. In many places, because Spaniards don't like to eat dinner until 9 or 9:30, there are restaurants along the Camino that kind of cater just to the pilgrims, and they generally open about 5 p.m. for dinner. So they'll have a couple of big tables, and the first 2 or 3 people get the first ones, and the next people who come get the next chairs. And so you're always at a big table with other pilgrims. And again, that's a nice community thing. And these are just typical musicians along the trail. And here they have a place where you can donate money. These people were local, but I have known pilgrims who are musicians who will play in the big cities. They'll play for several days, get enough money to get to the next big city, and then again stop and play enough music to get enough money to go on. And this bagpipe-like instrument is historic in Spain because there were a lot of Celts in Spain at one time, in northern Spain. This is the cathedral in Santiago. So it's in here that the body of St. James is. Actually, it's in the basement, but it's easy to go down. They've done a huge renovation in recent years. And of course, at first there was a little chapel above the bones, and then it got bigger, and then it burned down, and then it's a little bit bigger, and then that went down. This is the latest incarnation of the cathedral in Santiago. And of course, pews are a pretty modern invention. At one time, people would sleep inside the cathedral. There were all kinds of burglaries and so forth inside the cathedral, and it would be packed. And during the 1500s, they thought Sir Francis Drake, who was a pirate, but he mostly preyed on Spanish ships, which pleased the English Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. So she was happy to knight him, Sir Francis Drake. But they thought here in Santiago, they thought at one time that Sir Francis Drake was going to come and steal the body of Santiago. So they moved the body within the church. And then all the people who moved it died, and nobody knew where it was. But then at a future renovation, 300 years later, they came upon the body. So now it's back down in the basement, in the crypt. And there's a big statue of St. James on the altar, which people used to, pre-pandemic, go and hug and kiss. I don't suppose that's going to be happening now, post-pandemic or in the pandemic. And if you know what a censer is, dispenses incense in that cathedral in Santiago. They have one that goes up to the ceiling, in the high ceiling. It goes up to the ceiling on one side and then up to the ceiling on the other side. And it takes 8 men to move it. It's quite a deal. It has its own name. It's called the Bota Fumiero. And the guys who do the pulling have these special outfits. And I think it's quite an honor to be one of those guys. And this is some man I don't know, but I saw him and just took his picture. He's on the plaza in front of the cathedral, and you can see that he's dirty and he's exhausted and he's overwhelmed that he finally made it to Santiago. Some of them are excellently marked, and I would say they're all on the Camino Frances. If you're going from Saint Jean Pied de Port to Santiago, there's no worry about getting lost. All the marking and trail maintenance is done by volunteers who are members of Los Amigos de Santiago, and ones who I have met are very motivated to keep the signage up to date. And the sign is a yellow arrow on a blue background. That's the sign you're looking for. Further away, the signage varies. The different chapters of that organization are responsible for different segments of the trail, and some of them you can have a perfectly marked trail for 100 kilometers, and then all of a sudden you don't see anything. There's a minor problem of teenagers playing tricks on the pilgrims, that kind of thing. I once met some pilgrims who had gone around in a circle because some teenagers had changed the signage, but that's a minor problem. Yes, there are. These are, first world countries. There's medical support for their population and for their citizens, and pilgrims can take advantage of those same services. The online resource I would recommend first would be American Pilgrims on the Camino. This is a nationwide organization. You can be a member or not be a member. You can access all the information even not being a member. The members are mostly people who have walked the Camino, but there are also people who wish to walk the Camino or are just interested. They have a packing list. They have discussion of backpacks, what to look for. They just have a lot of information, and there's a question and answer area, and that's the English language site, obviously, so that would be the first place to go. As you go along, you need to have a credential, and because a lot of the albergues, you can only stay there if you have a credential. And to each place you go, you get a stamp, and then when you get to Santiago, you go to the Pilgrim office, and they will give you a Compostela. They'll give you this certificate. Buen Camino for all of you who are going, and I feel like there's many things that I have gained from walking the Camino. There's a poem by Philip Booth. The poem is teaching my daughter to swim, and the first lesson and the ending line is, when you're in trouble, lie back and the sea will hold you. And I love that line, lie back and the sea will hold you. So I've had a lot of things happen on the Camino. My husband died on the Camino. I broke my leg on the Camino. There have been days I thought I wasn't going to find a place to sleep, but eventually I did. And another expression that I've learned about the Camino is the kindness of strangers. There have been many times, not in Spain, but in Germany, in the Czech Republic, where I was lost and people came to my aid, and lie back and the sea will hold you. I just love that line.